Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants Hangout. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I will be your host for today. If you've been following along for the last week or so, we have been celebrating coral reefs. We've been looking at their beauty, their importance to the planet. We've also been looking at the impact that we're having on them and the threats that they're under from things like overfishing and climate change. We're also talking to lots of scientists and conservationists who are dedicating their lives to trying to find a solution to help protect reefs so we have them in the years to come. Really excited to be joined by Kelly Drinnen today. So Kelly joined the Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary team in August of 2004. She's an education outreach specialist. She's responsible for developing activities, lessons, displays, collaborating with zoos and aquariums, updating and maintaining the sanctuary website, community events, social media, workshops, and presentations. Sounds like she's a pretty busy person. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure Kelly will talk about a little more, but Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary is in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's home to a thriving coral reefs off the coast of Texas and Louisiana. So Kelly, it's so great that you took a break from your busy schedule to hang out with us today.
It's good to be here.
All right, excellent. Well, I know you have a little presentation prepared for us, so we're looking forward to it, and then we'll be ready with questions when you're ready.
All right, sounds good. Hello, everyone.
Let me turn the mics on. Let's get them to say hi, nice and loud, boys and girls, if you want to say hi.
Hello. Good to have you all here. I'm going to share a presentation with you first to talk a little bit about this, and then I'll be glad to answer your questions. And let's see what's going on with this. Okay. And here we go. Are you seeing it? There, I have to switch it again.
Just got to do the switch.
Yeah. Okay, there we are. So good afternoon, everyone. I thought I'd start out a little bit about what I do and why I'm here talking to you today. And the first thing that I tell people is that I am an education outreach specialist, as Joe just mentioned, for NOAA's Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary. And my office is in Galveston, Texas. I'm actually about 1.5 blocks from the beach, so I can't quite see the ocean from my office because of the way my window faces, but I'm pretty darn close. And here's a list of the different kinds of things I work on, and some of these were also mentioned by Mr. Grabowski. I do our website, and if you've been out doing some research, as I heard some of you might have been doing, what you're looking at is my work for the past 10 or 12 years. I've been working on this particular version of the website. And I do our social media, which involves Facebook and Twitter posts, and I plan for exhibits at zoos and aquariums and museums, and I even have a traveling exhibit that moves around to different areas of Texas. And I help teachers develop lesson plans. I actually provide some that I have developed in the past myself and work on activities. We do all sorts of community events to talk about the ocean and ocean conservation, as well as specifically our coral reefs off the Texas coast. And then we do workshops for teachers to help them teach in the classroom. And I even host a speaker series every year in February that we call Seaside Chats. But that's not all. Part of my job is also public relations. It's talking to the news media and helping them understand the different issues we're talking about. I also wear a hat where I assist our IT specialists with what goes on with our computer networks here and making sure everything's installed properly and running properly. And then, as an added bonus to my job, I actually get to go scuba diving with the researchers on different occasions, where I help them by doing fish surveys, because I'm a fish geek at heart and I love to see what I can find out there that I haven't met yet. So I'm counting and identifying fish. And then sometimes we're dissecting fish, like the invasive lionfish, where we want to understand what it is that they're eating out on our reefs, that these populations they might be affecting. So I get to help with those kinds of things too. And all of those flow together to help me do my job, which is to share the Flower Garden Bank's National Marine Sanctuary with everybody. But the question I usually get right after introducing myself and telling what I do is, there are coral reefs near Texas, are you sure? Because people who've been to the coastline here in Texas very often see brownish or greenish water, and that's not what we think of when we think of coral reefs. So I'm going to introduce you to this coral reef and explain to you why we can have them, even though we have this beautiful brownish greenish stuff at the coast, and introduce you to what we have out there. So this place out in the Gulf of Mexico called Flower Garden Banks is actually a national marine sanctuary. It's part of an overall group of protected underwater places that are kind of like our national parks, but they are all underwater. And unlike national parks, there's no gate you come into that says, hey, you're here. When you're there, you're in this big open stretch of ocean. And if you didn't see some of our mooring buoys where you could tie off, you wouldn't even know you were someplace special in the ocean unless you'd poked your head under the water and took a look. So national marine sanctuaries are not as well known as our national parks, but they do cover a lot of territory. In fact, all of our 14 sites together cover more area than all of the national parks and national wildlife areas combined. So we've got some pretty significant underwater territory that we're protecting. And like our national parks, these are places you can visit. It depends which site you're going to. You can see on the map here all the different places we have our sanctuaries, including in the Great Lakes. The Flower Garden Banks is the only one truly completely in the Gulf of Mexico, while the Florida Keys sanctuary lies right on the edge. But if you go out to these sanctuaries, there are different activities you can do, and what activities is determined by the needs and protective measures at each of the different sanctuaries. My sanctuary, for example, is over 115 miles offshore. So mostly only people going out there are people that get on a boat that's willing to travel that far. And then when you're out there, you're way out of sight of land. So mostly we see divers and fishermen out there. So you can actually dive and fish. But if you are a fisherman, you can only do it with hook and line. You can't use any other kind of fishing gear because we feel that would be dangerous and harmful to the reefs and possibly to the overall population of creatures living out there on the reefs. So every sanctuary is a little different in that respect. And here's the Gulf of Mexico. This is where we are located, and we are actually comprised of 3 different parts for the sanctuary: East Flower Garden Bank, West Flower Garden Bank, and Stetson Bank. And these 3 parts, the first 2, East and West Flower Garden Bank, are about due south of the Texas-Louisiana border. And right out near that dashed line you see in the Gulf, that's the edge of our continental shelf. So that's the edge of the shallower part of the reef. Part of the Gulf of Mexico. And if you get past that dashed line, then it drops into thousands of feet of depth. Well, in the area where we're located, it's generally about 300 to 500 feet deep. And that's not usually where you find coral reefs either. So the unique part out here is there's these little underwater mountains that were pushed up and formed into salt domes, and our coral reefs are located right smack on top of those. These are considered the northernmost coral reefs in the continental U.S. They are covered in these big, huge stony corals, which are also known as reef-building corals. And most of the varieties we have are considered a type of brain coral or a type of star coral. And what's unique about this location is, number one, that it's so far from shore, because most coral reefs are associated directly with a coastline, but that there's over 52% of the bottom is covered with coral. That means over half of what's out there is coral, and the rest of it is sand and whatever might be in between, and between the corals, like algae and sponges and things like that. So this photo you're looking at, that is about 80 feet of water. You can see it's crystal clear and blue out there. That's nothing like the water we see right here at the coast. And here along the coast of Louisiana and Texas, we're seeing the muddy sediments that come out the Mississippi River. And that currents that here in the Gulf wrap that right around our Texas coast. So when we go to the beach to go swimming, we can't see our feet. The water's not polluted, it's just got a lot of dirt and things suspended in the water instead of just sitting on the bottom. So we can actually go swimming and everything just fine here, but we're not going to see our feet like you can out here in the Flower Garden Banks. In this picture, you're seeing the hull of a boat at the surface of the water at the very top, a diver hovering somewhere in between, and the top of our reef starts about 55 or 60 feet underwater. So these are pretty deep reefs. They don't come right up near the surface like places in the Florida Keys or the Bahamas or down in Cancun and Cozumel. These are considered deeper reefs, but still diveable. They're within recreational dive limits of which is less than 130 feet. As I said before, these are 115 miles offshore to get to East and West Flower Garden Bank. That was the original sanctuary. It was just those 2 pieces, and that was established in 1992. And you'll see that the red markings there are the actual boundaries around those little underwater mountains with the coral reefs perched on top. We did separate boundaries like that because of major industry in the Gulf of Mexico in the form of oil and gas. And there's already a lot of platforms and drilling rigs out in the Gulf. There's already pipeline structure on the seafloor. And so by containing our boundaries tightly around the areas where the coral reefs are located, we avoided interfering with structure that was already in place before the sanctuary was designated. And oil and gas is a very important business, as you might guess, here in Texas. So to take a look at what the reefs look like up close and in photos, we've got some big, huge boulders and plates of corals, as you can see, especially in the center top picture. You can see how it kind of layers out. If you look at the left photograph, you're seeing the sand flat there. That's probably 80 feet underwater. And if I was sitting on the bottom right there, the coral's going up about 15 to 20 feet on either side of me. That means that coral's been growing there a really long time. That's about 15 to 20 feet of stuff that grows at only a quarter of an inch or so a year. And so it's very slow growing. It's taken a long time to get that tall. That tells us it's been there a very long time. In the bottom right, you're seeing a smaller type of coral that is just a very small piece in between with a little nudibranch alongside. And then the middle picture, you're seeing some of the broader reef with the fish swimming over top of it. Some more views of East and West Flower Garden Bank's typical scenery. Again, the plated out corals at the bottom left. At the top left, you're going to see that big, huge orange structure. That's actually a sponge, which is a living creature. A lot of people find that hard to believe, but everything's bigger in Texas, including our corals and our sponges. And we are very proud of what we've got out here as a very healthy ecosystem at a time when coral reefs around the world are being decimated by coral bleaching and all sorts of effects of pollution and overfishing and just all sorts of hazards out there for coral reefs. These have managed to stay safe, and we believe it's largely because of their remote location. It's a lot harder to get there. It takes us about 7 or 8 hours in the boat to get out there, and then we stay out there for 3 to 5 days at a time generally. We have a live-aboard research vessel. We can take 14 people, including our crew. So we go out there to work and stay out there for several days so we can get as much accomplished in one trip as possible. The bottom right picture is a big boulder type formation. We see a lot of this in the sanctuary, and some of these corals are as big as small cars. I drive a Honda Fit. Some of the corals out there are definitely bigger than my car. The center picture you see at the bottom is what the coral polyps, the animals that build the coral reef, look like. When you zoom in really close, you see these little gelatinous animals that are related to jellyfish and sea anemones, and they're actually building all of this hard structure out there that provides habitat for a variety of creatures. Now, Drinnen Bank was added to the sanctuary a little bit later in 1996, and that's about 70 miles offshore. It's about 30 to 35 miles northwest of East and West Flower Garden, West Flower Garden Bank. And when we get there, when you first get to the bottom, you see what's typically shown in the bottom right photo there, a lot of algae and rubble and some bumped up rock work and some sponges, and it's almost like a moonscape when you first get down here and you think, well, why was this added to the sanctuary? But then when you look around, you see there's so much wildlife here that is typical to what you find on a coral reef, that this is obviously also very important habitat for what we think of as usually being strictly coral reef fishes and species, but they actually like similar habitats as well. The top left is the most coral we have at Drinnen Bank. It's on the top of one of the peaks out there on one of the ridges. It has a lot of coral in that one spot, and then the rest of it, it's very little bits and pieces of coral here and there. So just that one part that has a lot of coral, and then the rest, what you're seeing in the top right, is typical habitat. Lots of different kinds of sponges. The purple, the orange, the red, the black, all those are sponges, again, living animals. And in between is the algae that's growing a lot around there, the marine plant life. And the bottom left, we have ridges. We have these stony ridges all over the place. And those are the result of the way these little underwater mountains were formed on which these different reefs perch. Because reef doesn't always mean coral. It can mean these algal sponge communities as well. And so these reefs are just perched on top of this underwater mountain, and because there's not as much coral cover, you're seeing the exposed rock that was broken and tipped on its side as the seafloor pushed up and made those mountains long, long ago. You're seeing the eroded areas, and you can see that creatures love to tuck down into those ridges. Here's another view of some parts of Stetson Bank. You can see the ridges in the top left. They're actually covered in fire coral. And then the bottom two photos, you see lots of sponge and algae, and then, of course, lots and lots of fish life. Things are just a little more out in the open here than they are on the coral reefs at East and West Flower Garden Bank because they have more places to hide there. And here they're kind of forced out in the open a little bit more because they're of less coral coverage. But truly phenomenal wildlife out here. Even with all of this, these three places I've shown you are just the caps on top of these little underwater mountains. They only go down to a depth of about 160, maybe 200 feet in places. And this is only about 1% of the sanctuary, what we call the reef or the diveable reef structure. Below that, we have to explore using remotely operated vehicles or ROVs. And this is what we see in the other 95 to 97% of the sanctuary, this kind of rubbly, hard bottom stuff that a lot of soft corals attach to. You didn't see any of this kind of stuff up in the upper reef, and that's another way we differ from things like you'll see in the Florida Keys. We don't have any soft corals in the diveable areas, but down deep we do, and we have a lot of what are called black corals. They're actually yellow, white, green, red, like you're seeing in the pictures here, but their interior skeleton is black rather than white, like the reef building corals in the shallower sections. So we have lots of fantastic stuff to explore, even in the deep areas. A little harder to get to because we have to use a remotely operated vehicle, and we can only see what's in the lens of the camera, but still interesting corals and habitats to explore. And what kind of wildlife lives there? Well, it's typical of what you're going to find in the rest of the Caribbean, but we don't have everything you'll find in the rest of the Caribbean. So we're a little bit of a subset because we're way up in the northern Gulf of Mexico. We're over 700 miles from the Florida Keys, and we're almost 500 miles from Cancun and Cozumel in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And those would be the closest coral reefs to where we're located. And so the wildlife has to have found its way through the currents and things all the way up to the northern Gulf, and therefore not all of them have found their way there. So here's some typical invertebrates you'll see. Octopus on the left, we have sea urchins in the top center, jellies on the right, and then the bottom photo there, you're actually looking at some marine worms. What you're seeing are just their gills. We call these Christmas tree worms because of the shape of their gills. And each pair that you see there belongs to one worm. So there's an orange worm and a yellow worm and a yellow and white worm. And in the back of the photo where things are a little faded, you can see there are a few more. And their bodies are actually encased in tubes that are burrowed down into the coral structure itself. So just their gills show out to people. And typical fish life, we've got eels, we've got things that live on the bottom, things that are brightly colored, things that are cryptic or blend in more with their environment. We've got the game fish like the jacks you see on the right-hand side that are predators circling above the reef hoping for a snack. And we also have a couple of really unique fish out here. The bottom center photo is a fish called the smooth trunkfish, and everywhere else in the Caribbean, it's black with white spots. But we also have this gold version. It is the same DNA, the same genetics, but for whatever reason, it's a different color. And we're one of the only places in the world where this is found. So it's really cool. It's kind of a good luck charm to come across one of these in your dives. But the gold, we call it the golden smooth trunkfish. And then the top right, the purple and gold fish you see there, we call that the Mardi Gras wrasse. And we call it that because we got to name it. You see, this was a new fish to science as recently as 2008. The scientific paper for that came out in December of 2008, almost exactly 10 years ago. And this was a fish that was identified by some underwater photographers out there, and they couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't match any of the ID books and what they knew of all the wildlife out there. So they came to us and said, we think this is something a little different. And our explorations showed that it was in fact true. And they did the genetic workup. It's a completely different fish than anybody's seen before. Full grown, it's only about 4 or 5 inches long. So that's almost a full-size photo on your screen there of that Mardi Gras wrasse, and of course named for its purple and gold colors. The scientific name, we got to pick that too. It's called Helicures bureki. And if you look at the credits on both the golden smooth trunkfish and that Mardi Gras wrasse, the Burecs are the people who took that photo, and we named this particular fish after them for bringing it to our attention. So you never know what you're going to find. We have other things that have been discovered in the Gulf of Mexico named for some of our staff here at the Flower Garden Banks because they've been discovered in like the last 10 and 20 years. So there's always something new to find out there in the ocean. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the really big, really cool stuff out there. On my first dive ever at the Flower Garden Banks, I saw the big, huge manta rays, and I wasn't in the water a minute before I saw them. There were 2 of them came swooping around within 6 feet of me. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. The manta rays, what you see in the bottom right there, they're just very graceful, beautiful animals. They're not a danger to people. There's no stinger on their tail like on stingrays, and they eat plankton. So they're just swooping and swirling around and sucking up the plankton from the water column around you. And they seem curious about people sometimes and not other times. And I got lucky in my very first dive. They were curious to see who we were. Top left is a whale shark. That is the biggest fish on the planet. It can grow up to 60 feet. They average more in about the 35 to 40-foot range, about the size of a school bus. And the ones we see tend to be more often in about the 20-foot range. And that's this one you're seeing in this photo, I want to say, was the 20 to 30-foot range. And they seem to come through in the summertime. We don't see them as often. They're not as predictable as the manta rays that we see all year round, but it's still a really cool experience. I've seen them 4 times now, and this last time I actually got to jump in the water and snorkel looking down on one. It had already dove deep beneath the water by the time I got in, but it was still a pretty cool experience. The sea turtle on the top right is a hawksbill turtle. It's one of 2 species we find out here. We also have loggerhead turtles. And then the bottom, we have a scalloped hammerhead. We get lots of those schooling in the wintertime, as well as many other kinds of sharks. And rather than being scared of them, we actually look forward to seeing them when we're diving. It actually really makes a fantastic dive when you get to see these kinds of beautiful animals swimming by in their environment, where we're the visitors. So it's a pretty amazing experience. So overall, Flower Garden Banks is a really phenomenal place. If you guys want to talk to me more about it after this, Mr. Grabowski will have my contact info, but there's my contact info too, if you want to write it down. And at this point, I'll leave that up for a few more seconds, but I'm ready to take some questions.
All right, awesome. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for showing that part of the world where you work. It looks absolutely incredible. And yeah, there really isn't a lot of spots around North America, or at least around Canada and the US, where you can find coral. So those little spots are pretty special.
Yes, they are. And I was so excited the first time I ever went, and I saw manta rays too. That was just more than I could have ever hoped for.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn things over to the classrooms. We'll let them obviously ask anything about coral reefs and the National Protected Area. And maybe they have some questions about you and scuba diving too. So let's get started. So we're going to go to Stockbridge, Georgia to start. We've got some high schools joining us with Mrs. Majette. Let me turn her microphone on. How's it going, everyone? All right. I'm glad we got your speakers working. Does anybody have a question for Kelly?
Yes.
Come up nice and close so we can hear you.
So you said only certain sharks come out in the summer. Hear me?
Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Just come nice and close. We kind of missed it.
You said only certain sharks come out in the summer.
Okay. I think you might just be missing the microphone. Maybe kind of get a little more centered on the screen and try.
All right. You said only certain sharks come during the summer.
So actually, some things are more seasonal. It's a matter of we're out there more in the summer and more likely to see things because that's when the weather usually cooperates for us to get out there, and the currents this time of year, a lot of storms and things, it's harder to get out there. But the whale sharks, we believe, are probably migrating up from Mexico. We don't know this for sure. There are people studying these and trying to figure this out. But one tagged whale shark that was tagged down to the Yucatan in Mexico was actually recorded on an acoustic receiver about 13 miles outside the sanctuary at another area called Bright Bank many years ago. So we know that at least one of them was migrating up this way. We're hoping that continued studies will give us a better picture of that. But whale sharks are just not up in this area all the time. The manta rays we do see around the banks all year round. Other sharks, it's just a matter of if they're there when we're there for us to know more about them. But we've never seen the whale sharks in the winter. The other sharks we see on and off throughout the year if we do get out there at different times, just not the whale sharks.
All right, let's jump to another classroom. Let's go to Guelph, Ontario this time. We've got some grade 6 students joining us with Mrs. Gallant. Let me turn on her microphone. How's it going, grade 6s?
Hi.
We're really excited. We have a question. Oh, you can go next.
Come nice and close for us. The microphones aren't picking up very well today.
I was wondering how long Kelly has been working.
Did you hear that?
Can
No.
you try and repeat it for us?
We're just wondering, Joseph's wondering how long has Kelly been working in the sanctuary?
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been working here at the Flower Garden Banks for 14 years as of August. And before that, I worked at a zoo and aquarium facility called Moody Gardens here in Galveston. And I was the education director there, helping them put together programs for school groups to visit and things like that. And before that, I actually worked at the SeaWorld Park in Orlando, Florida. And that's where I got my career start. So I've been working in marine science education for a long time, but the last 14 years here with the Flower Garden Banks.
All right. And let's open up the microphone in Mrs. Hearn-Smith's class. They're joining us from Stratford, Ontario, grade 4s. How's it going, grade 4?
Do y'all have a question?
Do the plants and animals at the coral reef depend on each other to survive?
Do the plants and animals depend on each other? They certainly do. So if we don't have enough of one thing or not enough of another thing, then somebody's not going to get what they need to eat or survive. So one of the really important things on a coral reef, especially with the health of reefs lately, is having the right number of predators and the right number of herbivores and planktivores and everything else. So we need the herbivores especially to keep the algae down on the reef, because if there's algae grows faster than coral, and if we don't have enough herbivores to keep it in check, then our corals are going to get smothered by the algae and we won't have coral reefs. And when we have a lot of nutrients getting in the water, that also helps algae grow more quickly. So the herbivores become even more important. But it's also important to have the big carnivores, the predators, because they have to keep everything in balance and they help get rid of the sick animals and the weak animals so that the strongest are surviving and helping with the overall health of the reef. So yes, it's very important for all the plants and animals to be there in the right balances. Even though we don't have the same thing, all of the same things as the rest of the Caribbean coral reefs, we have a nice balance of the right things that are making this ecosystem work.
All right, great question. And let's go back to our class in Georgia. I know you guys have to leave soon for the end of your day. So if you have another question, your microphone is on.
Another question? No, I think they're ready to leave, so.
Okay, that's okay. I'm going to ask a question. You mentioned, Kelly, you talked a little bit about some of the relationships on the reef, like the herbivores keeping the algae in check, the predators keeping the prey in check. Coral has a pretty special relationship with some algae, doesn't it?
It sure does. Very good point. So the corals, there are all different kinds of corals throughout the world, and they can occur from shallow to deep waters, warm to cold waters. But specifically the ones we're talking about here are what we call reef-building corals. And those reef-building corals can't survive without the help of a special algae called zooxanthellae. And it's a really cool word that has the root words for animal and plant in it. And that's because it has this really close animal-plant relationship. Coral can't survive without reef-building coral, can't survive without it. So the algae is actually embedded into the coral animal. It lives in its tissues. It's almost, it gives it its color. So it'd be like something inside your skin was giving you the color of your skin. And if that was gone, we'd be able to see right through you. That's what happens with corals. So when we hear about coral bleaching, it's because those algae have left. It becomes too stressful an environment for the coral to live in. The algae leave and you're seeing clear corals there and you're seeing through to their white skeletons. And that's why we get the idea that they might be bleaching. But on a day-to-day basis, corals get about 70 to 75% of their food from the algae. And the algae create food how? They're plants. So how do they create food?
Let's see. Let's try Mrs. Gallant's class in Guelph, see if they know how plants make food.
Awesome. Very good, guys. So photosynthesis is what the algae do, which is why your coral reefs are found in areas where it's warm and shallow. Sunlight is important for their survival because those algae that live in the tissues of the coral are actually providing food to the coral. About 70 to 75% of their food comes from those algae. So without the algae, they start to starve. They can catch some stuff with their tentacles, but it's not enough to survive in the long term. So if the environment gets too stressful and the algae leave, we have to do something to fix that environment. And sometimes hurricanes like we're having in the Gulf right now are the perfect answer, as silly as that sounds, because they come in and they churn up the water and they make things cooler. When it's too hot for the corals, they can cool off by bringing in different currents and mixing things up. And sometimes hurricanes are the best solution to when we have a bleaching problem. It helps cool things down and the algae come back and help the corals.
All right. I think that is such a cool relationship, that symbiotic relationship. Not only can they grab some food from the water, but they can get some energy from the sun from their algae friends. That's pretty cool. All right, let's go to Mrs. Hearn-Smith's class and turn their microphone on. Do you guys have another question for Kelly?
What's an example for a food chain where you guys live?
Oh, wow. You're going to make me think of a specific food chain. Okay. Well, we have a lot of sandbar sharks that we see when we visit Stetson Bank in particular. They're at both places, but we see them more often at Stetson. And those would eat some of the big jacks, those silverfish that were in the one picture I showed you. They eat the big jacks that are swimming around. And one time when I was diving there, I saw those big jacks going after some smaller snapper. And the snapper ran and hid under a rock as it got weeded out from the school it was swimming in. And those jacks went after it till they got it and got it out from under the rock. And then those snapper like to eat some of the smaller fish out there. And the smaller fish eat the algae and the plankton and on down to, I guess, the plankton. That's as small as you can get. So we've got a sandbar shark, followed, let's say, an amberjack, followed by a gray snapper, followed by a creole fish, followed by plankton. Or instead of the creole fish, we picked a damsel, and then it eats little small crustaceans and things. How's that?
Right. Very good. Well done.
Making me think.
Yes. All right. Back to Guelph, Ontario. If our grade sixes have another question.
I need you. I'm very good basketball, so you can come up nice and close. Yeah. People, you just have to be quiet. Okay, yeah.
Could you repeat that?
What kind of scuba gear do you need?
Oh, good question. So scuba gear, we have to be able to see underwater. Can you see with just your eyes when you open them underwater? Can you see clearly? No. So what do we need for that? Yeah, we need a mask. So that's probably the most important thing. If we're going to see what we're doing, we need the mask. And then we also need a way to breathe underwater. So we need air. It's not oxygen in our tanks. It's actually air. They take air from that you breathe every day and they shove it down into a tank where it's under pressure. So they're packing a lot of air into a metal tank that you wear on your back. And then the top of that tank is connected to your mouth by something called a regulator. It's a hose with a special valve on the end that goes right into your mouth. And when you breathe in, it lets air out of the tank and into your mouth without exploding out of there. It actually works to relieve the pressure as it's going to your mouth. And then when you breathe out, the air bubbles come out your regulator, and that's the bubbles you see around divers when they're swimming. We also need fins to help us get around because that's a lot more efficient than kicking with our non-webbed toes. And what else do we need? We need what we call a buoyancy compensator device. Sounds complicated, but it's basically a big vest we wear that can have air into it. So there's a hose from the tank that also connects to that vest, and we can pump air into that vest. And that helps us regulate how heavy or light we are underwater so that we don't sink to the bottom and we don't go zooming way up to the top like a balloon if you let it loose. That's with too much air. So we regulate how much air is in that to give us what we call neutral buoyancy. It means we don't sink or float. We just stay wherever we swim to, we can just stay. And that is really great thing that I like to do. I like to hover really close just above the bottom and stare in between rocks and corals and things to see what I can find that is very tiny that I might not have seen before when I was just swimming over the reef and very quickly.
All right. You're making me miss my scuba gear. I will be diving next week. So I'll just have to wait one more week. All right. So boys and girls, why don't you, we've got a couple more minutes. So why don't you give me a wave if I should come back to your classroom for another question. So give me a wave at the camera and I'll know to come back. So I'm getting tons of waving in Guelph, Ontario. So we'll start there. All right, who's got the question?
Good morning. Do we have another question?
How's life going?
Can we do another question or no?
Yeah, if you have one, go ahead.
Okay, Sean, can you yell really loud? I can let you ask me. Sorry, you guys have the same question.
How many different types of species are in the coral reef?
I didn't quite get that.
Can you ask how many different types of species?
How many types of species are in the
Coral reef.
Oh, how many species do we have? Wow, a lot. And it's way bigger than you ever think. We have over 300 species of fish alone. And after that, I don't know. We have a website and you can go look, and you are welcome to count our species list if you'd like. But I know it's hundreds of species of mollusks, which are your clams and your snails and your octopus and squid and things. And we have over 350 species of fish. We have 26 species of corals. But as far as all the other little tiny stuff that we look at, the lists go on and on and on. We've got worms and crabs and shrimp, and you just can't even imagine all the things that are living out there. So thousands.
All right, so some great biodiversity. Let's visit Mrs. Hearns. You guys have another question.
3:15 pickup for the front foyer.
Oh, sounds like we've got announcements going on your end.
I know cross-country runners have just come back and some are still in the hallway. So if you're quiet in those areas.
All right, I'm going to put that on pause. I'm going to ask you a question, Kelly, about the threats to the marine sanctuary. Are there threats that you have to contend with?
So other than what we've mentioned previously about the climate change is causing the seas to get warmer, which means that we have situations where the corals get stressed more often. They have a very specific temperature range they live in. And ours, like about 68 to 84 degrees Fahrenheit. Their limit in Celsius, I know, is about 30 degrees. And if it gets above that for very long, that's when we see the stress and the algae leave, and we see the bleaching problems. We also see problems, of course, with pollution on coral reefs where there's a lot of sediments and things coming off land, which is the main reason these reefs don't survive up near the Texas coast. We have all that sediment coming out the big Mississippi River that wraps right around the coast there, and that would completely smother corals. They also need the sunlight to get through to them for the algae, and with all that sediment in the water, you wouldn't get that. But one of the big things we're fighting right now all throughout the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico is the invasive lionfish. And this is a fish that comes from the Pacific Ocean. It's not a problem there, but over here, it doesn't have any natural predators. Nothing is eating it. It reproduces at the rate of 50,000 eggs every 3 days once the females are sexually mature. And that means we're getting tens of thousands of eggs out there every year from these lionfish. And lionfish are everywhere. It's like they're taking over the planet when you look at a coral reef. And so we've already determined it's too late for us to get rid of them completely. So what we practice in a lot of coral reef areas is control measures, where we go out and remove as many as we can on dive trips and snorkeling trips and things, depending where you are. With us, it has to be diving. Snorkeling doesn't help. But we remove those, and that's where those dissections come in that I mentioned. When we remove them out in the sanctuary, we actually take them back to the lab and we dissect them so we can look at their stomach contents. And that tells us what species of fish are specifically being affected by the lionfish. And the problem is they're eating everything. What we see most are these little red night shrimp in their stomachs. And that's something they're not finding in lionfish in other areas. And we're really not sure what the ecological importance is of those little red night shrimp. So we're watching this very closely, but we're also removing lionfish as regularly as possible. The problem is they come back and they move in the areas, but the times where we remove them, there's a good 6 month to a year lapse where they actually get a little bit of a relief from all the lionfish pressure in those areas where we can do the removals. So that's where we are right now. But if you go to our website, I've got a lot of information up there about the lionfish, and I got pictures from our dissections. And I think if you Google on Facebook Live, we did a whole dissection on Facebook Live a year or so ago. You might still be able to find that video out there. but lots of really good information about that invasive species. And this summer, we also identified a new exotic species. And we're just calling it exotic right now, meaning it doesn't come from here. It also comes from the Pacific. It's a little fish called a regal demoiselle, and it's a small fish. It only gets to about, excuse me, 3 to 5 inches. But they're already in the thousands. They weren't there last summer at all. And this summer, by the time we noticed them, they're already in the thousands. And we don't know if they're harmful or not. And that's what makes something invasive. It can be exotic and it can be new without being a problem. And that's the case, we don't worry about it. But if it does become a problem, if it's eating up stuff that takes food away from our native species, if it's displacing some of our native species, then we have to worry about it. And so this is a new thing we're going to have to start watching. And we're hoping maybe when we get to the dissections this fall, that we're going to find some of them in the stomachs of the lionfish. That'd be nice if one invasive was helping with another.
All right. Well, Kelly, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Sounds like a beautiful spot, a park that would be amazing to visit. So hopefully we have some future scuba divers who make their way down to Texas. Boys and girls, as per usual, your questions were great. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today. And again, Kelly, it was great to have you joining us today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for sharing.
All right. Well, let me turn the microphones on if the classrooms want to say goodbye and thank you. Nice and loud. I know the grade 6s are ready. All right. Well, again, everyone, thanks for hanging out. Lots more coral reefs over the next week. Coral reef events over the next week and a half. We'll see you soon.